This video is possible thanks to contributions to the Existence University Patreon by viewers like you. Thank you. We have talked about a few issues on this channel in regard to identity, gender, sex, and the issue of sexual morality, as well as neurodiversity and its apparent trendingness. So today, we are going to put it all together and address the issue of whether or not trans is trending. First comes definitions, then comes clarifications, then comes the trans baby and their fabulous baby carriage. Too long, didn't watch. Technically, yes. Yes, in the same way left-handedness trends, when you stop beating children for being that way. And technically, no. No, in the same way that left-handed people didn't stop existing just because you thought that last wallop knocked the devil out of them. Definitions. Currently, there are at least 3 sets of definitions. The quote-unquote lefts, the quote-unquote rights, and mine. It is my argument that the history of their definitions are too messy and too inaccurate to form a proper objective scientific and philosophical understanding of sexual identity, hence the confusions about it today. You cannot get a straight answer from the LGBTQ+ side, and all of the arguments the right uses to oppose them sounds a bit queer to my ear. As I stated in my last trending video, and have had problems in the past with what is called the double empathy problem, meaning that I'm not sure how to speak to everyone properly, and in return, they don't know how to interpret me. All I can guarantee in speaking to you on this topic is that you will always be wrong about my opinion if you attempt to jump to conclusions based on previous experience, talking or listening to others. In order to understand my definitions on this topic, we need to establish my worldview. Everyone should do this when having such a big conversation. If more people did this, you would realize most people do not live in the same world that they're arguing about. Existence exists. Consciousness is conscious. Existence have identities. Consciousness does the identifying. Knowledge is a mental grasp of the facts of reality, reached either by perceptual observation or by a process of reason, which is based on perceptual observation. Concepts are mental integrations of 2 or more units possessing the same distinguishing characteristics with their particular measurements omitted. A definition is a statement that designates the essential distinguishing characteristics and genus of the existence subsumed under a given concept. Reason, man's tool of knowledge, the faculty that enables him to perceive the facts of reality, which has to be exercised by choice, the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. Psychoepistemology, the study of man's cognitive processes from the aspect of the interaction between the conscious mind and the automatic functions of the subconscious, the method of awareness. Objectivist morality, or objective morality. A code of values accepted by choice, which judges what is good or evil by holding a standard of values based on that which is required for a man's survival qua man. This is the base. On to the main topic definitions. Personality. The set of psychoepistemological and psychological traits which are manifestations of one's values and the views of oneself in relation to those values. Sex. Either of the 2 major forms of individuals that occur in many species and are distinguished respectively as female or male, especially on the basis of their reproductive organs and structures. Sexuality. The set of psychoepistemological, psychological, and sexual traits which are manifestations of one's values and the views of oneself in relation to those values. I have 2 options for you to choose from for gender, as I don't consider that particular word to be useful. Gender, an anti-concept which introduces sexism into every facet of life, a narrowed down, inverted definition of stereotype, or gender, a standardized mental picture that is held in common by members of one sex and that represents an oversimplified opinion, prejudiced attitude, or uncritical judgment about behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits. Clarification time. We should already be onto the part of the video where everyone is mad at me, so it's time to clarify. Psychoepistemology covers a basis in genetics, neurology, and free will psychology, and the interplay that exists between all these factors and more. My arguments apply regardless of the degree or severity of one or more of the factors applicable to the cases at hand. Your personality and sexuality are based on who you are and how you respond to that. We cannot negate nor neglect body or mind from the process of what is essentially a process of a self-made soul. Morality applies to a man alone on a desert island. He must do what he can to survive and thrive, which can only be done through a process of reason. If your personality and or sexuality requires that you actively avoid using reason for some hedonistic gain, whether or not it comes at the cost of violating the standard of value of another human, that would be wrong, i.e., immoral. That does not mean hell. Objective morality is not religious. It just means will be bad for you in the long term. When I made my original video on sexual morality, people jumped to the conclusion that the conclusion of the video was that any LGBTQ activities are evil, and that's it, when that was not the conclusion at all. The conclusion was that everyone needs to use reason to deconstruct whether or not their personality and sexuality was manifested by means which they themselves would be bad reasons to act in certain ways. By this standard, I actually believe that more LGBTQ+ people follow this practice than religious conservatives. For example, the way Ben Shapiro talks about his wife and the purpose of sex in humans makes me more uncomfortable than consenting LGBTQ+ couples. The confusion, I believe, came from the fact that I also didn't shy away from the physical harms of certain sexual practices that, again, all sides are capable of engaging in, especially religious conservatives in secret. So when you hear me say sexual morality or that's immoral, remember that I just mean, in essence, that which karma will come back to bite you for if you are not careful. And finally, why I don't think gender is a concept at all. The trans baby in the fabulous baby carriage. Sexual differences are obvious, especially in animals, but also in certain plants. The fact of the matter is that reproducing with two different members of a species is evolutionarily more fit for continuous reproduction through the benefits of diversity in the genetic material. And so there will likely never be a reason for any species of animal to evolve back to asexual reproduction. And so any and all details about intersex genetics is outside the essential defining characters of animals. The existence of intersex people does not affect the definition of animals pertaining to their sexual dichotomy. Sexual differences are true to the bone, and those that are anti-trans love to bring this one up, that archaeologists will disagree when they dig up their bones in 1,000 years. This idea opens the floodgates. It's true. It's absolutely true that if history is lost and our graves are buried under hundreds of years of sedimentation, a future civilization will be able to find us and identify our species and sex and approximate age from our bones. But there is something way more important here. Why were we buried at all? We humans bury our dead, not just for sanitary reasons, but for religious reasons. Do you know what else, besides sex differences, is obvious to primitive humans? Whether or not one of them ever thought it or not. One is that things exist, and two, that they exist and can see those other things. What is not obvious is that just because you can think and act does not mean that everything can think and act. So primitive humans assumed that all things could think and act just like them. They identified the differences between themselves and the other types of beings, and they created gods to explain actions which were so big they affected everything else. For instance, a storm can throw rocks, plants, animals, and therefore a storm is more powerful than all of them, and must be the act of something epic. So primitive humans create gods, which are just like the abusive people who can always outpower them. They turn to appeasing and worshipping. Anything to get them to stop. This is the basis of the corrupted idea of the patriarchy. I say that the idea of the patriarchy is corrupt because it itself is white colonial sexism, for it reduces the idea that primitive humans worshipped an abusive nature, as if it were an abusive person, and stripped the earlier cultures of Africa and India, which had matriarchies like Kali, who also destroy the world and need to be appeased, whereas the idea of patriarchy has reduced it down to just the Greek and Western religions, where the godheads happen to be a man. The worship of that abusive nature, now named God, leads to the practices of understanding and interpreting the gods. Practices today which have lost all of its meaning, but hold on to that mythical past which sets the foundation of this concept of gender. From the notions available to us as primitive thinkers, we can conclude that there are things more powerful than us, which can cause patterns to exist, which we know patterns are things that we do, so that entity must be an intellectual thing like we are. And we can distinguish objects from each other, and even distinguish subcategories from each thing. Ergo, the gods must have created that pattern for a reason. One obvious pattern is that animals have two types, the male and the female. Therefore, the gods want there to be two kinds. Since we see X do this and Y do that, that must be the way the gods intended it. To honor our gods, we must give favor to our dead. We thus have burial rites which depend on their type. And in fact, we see this in archaeological burial sites. In some cultures, men face north or south, and the women will face the opposite. Or both will face the south, but men on their right sides and women on their left, or vice versa. Or the men are extended and the women curled up. And as the anti-trans side states, we can identify their sex in their bones. Here's the catch. Sometimes the bones don't match the burial rites. Clearly male in the bones, clearly female in the burial. So clearly, cultures make exceptions to their sex-based rules. Why? Because everyone is different and the gods don't exist. There is no special meaning to your sex. There is no magic associated with your sex. Your values as a human are human values. And those cultures that deem a human virtue or value to one sex only will always have to make exceptions to the rule. What am I saying? I am saying that the concept of gender comes from a history of mythology and poor definitions. That to be one gender or another, or neither, or both, is a cultural package deal with a belief system in some god or gods. And this is not a new opinion. Here is Plato in Symposium saying what I am saying by mocking the character Aristophanes, who is holding a mythical view of sex, and therefore also a set of mythical divine traits of a gender. Aristophanes says, "The sexes were originally three, men, woman, and the union of the two, and they were made round, having 4 hands, 4 feet, 2 faces on a round neck, and the rest to correspond. Terrible was their strength and swiftness, and they were essaying to scale heaven and attack the gods. Doubt reigned in the celestial councils. The gods were divided between the desires of quelling the pride of man and the fear of losing the sacrifices. At last, Zeus hit upon an expedient. 'Let us cut them in two,' he said. 'Then they will only have half their strength, and we shall have twice as many sacrifices.' He spake and split them as you might split an egg with a hair. And when this was done, He told Apollo to give their faces a twist and rearrange their persons, taking out the wrinkles and tying the skin in a knot about the navel. The two halves went about looking for one another, and were ready to die of hunger in one another's arms. Then Zeus invented an adjustment of the sexes, which enabled them to marry and go their way to the business of life. Now the characters of men differ accordingly, as they are derived from the original man, or the original woman, or the original man-woman. Those who come from the man-woman are lavish and adulterous. Those who come from the woman form female attachment. Those who are a section of the male follow the male and embrace him, and in him all their desires center. The pairs are inseparable and live together in pure and manly affection. Yet they cannot tell what they want of one another. But if Hephaestus were to come to them with his instruments and propose that they should be melted into one and remain one here and hereafter, they would acknowledge that this was the very expression of their want. For love is the desire of the whole, and the pursuit of the whole is called love. There was a time when the two sexes were only one, but now God has halved them. Here Aristophanes has used his belief in the Greek gods to suppose a reason for the two sexes, and more than that, this 380 BC text states forthrightly that there are heterosexuals and homosexuals. When your world has a god or gods, and that god or gods is said to have created humans and animals, then too they are said to have created sex, created a pattern of two-ness, of dualness, of conflict and cooperation, of yin and yang, etc. Then there is a special meaning to the duality, and so there are traits that must be associated with that duality, as all things need distinct identities. The false distinction here created formed the basis of the foundation of gender, which means that the majority will fall within the statistical average of the binary. But every culture, without fail, will need to introduce a divine cause that explains the exception to that rule. Some cultures will assume that the child is a reincarnation of a sexless god entity. Some assume that the child is the victim of an evil spirit. This is why I don't care for the term gender. Gender to me means belonging roughly to some cultural stereotype established to prevent the gods from earthquaking us. So personally, I don't think that there can be such a thing as transgenderism, as that is just implying that you are changing an interest or hobby to one some culture deems to be for only the opposite sex. Transgender then being really some cultural relativism, where from the perspective of this culture, you are now being a woman, where to some other, you may be acting more like a man than ever before. In a different vein, I also don't think that there is such a thing as transsexual, as one cannot cosmetically change sexes. But all I have done here is removed labels from the people that are just living their best lives. What a culture holds to be true does not make it true, and yet what a culture holds to be true does have an impact on the individuals in that culture. Today we have access to every culture that has ever existed, given they left enough information to piece together their worldview. And with that expansion of culture also came an expansion of personalities and sexualities. And this provides us an answer to our initial question. Is trans a trend? No. No, because there truly is no such thing as trans. That is a monocultural viewpoint. What is trending is a deconstruction of mythologies, such as the notions that the queer kids are possessed by Satan, which is a great thing. Unfortunately, however, the deconstruction didn't go far enough in my opinion. The fact that those that are, and those that support LGBTQ+ people still base their identity around those cultural mythologies. For example, a person who considers herself to be a trans woman, I say considers only because of the logical case I am presenting, where this individual is using that mythological gendered history as the basis of their identification, and not because I don't consider them to be who they claim to be. has given this argument against me. Quote, I think that's quite a reductive way to view gender. I think gender is actually quite easy to understand. It's a combination of sex, clothing, attitudes, hobbies, interests, relationships, and feelings. Any combination of these can be gender in my mind. This is literally defining gender through a reductionist view, where that which is gender is reduced to the stereotypes of sex in some culture. I also do see a trend in trans, and that is that those that are seeing the pro-LGBTQ+ movement as a deconstructionist movement of Western religious cultures are jumping onto the bandwagon, so to speak, to get out of the country of the old world, which deems anything different from the perfectly average as possessed by a demon. However, that bandwagon is led by groups of people that essentially hold the same exact mythological belief, except that they believe in the divine power of the opposite forces. Feminism is mythological and essentially says that female gods are better and boys suck. Hence the trans exclusionary brand of feminism. Many trans groups simply say, if you are culturally different in some sex-related way, then you are the opposite gender. To me, again, that just sounds like if you are culturally different in sex-related ways, then you are the opposite stereotype. The problem with the bandwagon is that it might bring people to a point of no return before those people fully understand where the wagon is going. I'm going to stop calling it a bandwagon, it's not that. But it is kind of like a protest bus or a bus out of town kind of bus, where people know that they need to get the hell out of where they are living in, and this vehicle is going in the general direction they want to go. This applies to everyone again though, doesn't it? For instance, many of the people that don't want to have to change their cultural views on pronouns for what are valid freedom of speech and freedom of thought human rights end up on the Jordan Peterson bandwagon that awoken this cringe masculinity based on Christian mythology movement. Which has done what exactly? We have learned that lobsters and humans are different but similar, that a clean room is nice, and that people that call themselves alpha males have very weird private lives, and that cryptocurrency is to be held on for as long as the scammer demands to maximize the scammer's rug pull. Feminism is likewise cringe. These mythological ideas of power in a sex just creates lonely people. Final answer to the question, is trans trending? No and yes. It can be difficult to put your mental thoughts and selections into concrete forms, and so slogans and thought experiments and memes are shared, and they trend through a group of people which already existed, and those that are heading in that direction have a delivery system of memes which aid their discoveries. This trend is so far beyond this one corner of human existence. What difference is this, in one sense, from a taste in music? An individual pop star, or group of individuals, sharing their souls with others becomes trendy as more and more people are able to express emotions and ideas that they already had through someone else's concretization of thought, emotions, and experiences. Trans is as trendy as self-improvement and self-actualization can be. And so there will be people that get caught up in the self-actualization process and might hop on a bandwagon that leads them down a path they never intended to travel, and do not realize their mistake until it's too late. And that, again, is true of all things. This is exactly how good Christians end up in bad cults. If not gender, then what? So maybe I have done a good enough job, and you were able to follow along with me, and you're all in agreement, but it nags at you, and you're all like, okay, so you removed gender from my lexicon, but like, what are we going to call people of various transnesses? Let's take it back to the start. We are primitive cavemen again, but we have our history of logical thinking methods and a list of fallacies to not make with us this time around. Animal sexual differences are still obvious, but we don't create any gods or mythologies about the creation of male and female. We conclude objectively that living things reproduce, and diversity is a genetic winner, and genetic winners reproduce more, and diversity is more easily introduced through pair bonding, which also has the benefits that there are 2 protectors and supporters of the offspring. 3 would not be easier, as copulation would be much rarer. So we conclude that there are males and there are females because it's genetically advantageous. From here, we could try to form subtraits, but the only traits we can form are those that are differences of sex. The anatomy differs. Any notion that one sex is braver or more nurturing would only be temporary, as someone of the opposite sex in the tribe will eventually prove that wrong. Any facts of anatomy, like males are stronger, is technically just genetic. It's not a blessing from Hercules, and we could start breeding to make females the ones with more muscle mass. So it is certainly not essential across all time or species. Furthermore, the purpose of reproduction in such a world would not be because a god demands it, but because a couple want it. So really, there would be no major reason to distinguish between the sexes at all, except to talk about baby making. Presumably, in such cases, I would assume a surrogate would volunteer, as has been the case for all of recorded history. Abraham and his wife Sarah in the Bible had a surrogate. So in this fantasy caveman history, I would assume we would probably base appearance on size, strength, and general hygiene and wardrobe, and skin tone. But since we don't have any religious tales of where the races come from, and we know we are all human, the context of using skin tone has no racist implications. There is no way to really know what we would be using as a naming convention, but you can speculate your own in the comments below. I just don't think that we would rely so heavily on sexual differences. What I do know is that that does not help us here and now in this reality. For now, I'm just going to call them human, and do what I do for all people, call them what they want to be called. Because in all honesty, humans confuse me regardless. The fact that a straight white male wants to be called a straight white male confuses me just as much as when they want to be called anything else. I'm just more confused at why they're talking to me at all. He, she, they, those pronouns are not, in my mind, based on the definition of female or male. My car is a she. My stuffy is a he. If I am being medical, woman means adult human female. If I just want to talk about a person that was born male but looks like a woman, and what that means to look like a woman is that their size, strength, general hygiene, and wardrobe belong to the label of women or women's fashion, and I don't want to say everything I had to just say to clarify the minute details of this person's life, I'm just going to say woman. But what do you think? What would society have resorted to if male and female didn't have such strong religious symbolism? How would we refer to others in public to help the person we're talking to understand the person we mean? Do you think we would still use sex differences, or something else? Let me know in the comments below, and if you made it this far in the video, like and subscribe, why don't ya? This video is possible thanks to contributions to the Existence University Patreon by viewers like you. Thank you.